MapleStory is a game with a lot of classes to choose from, over 50 at this point. On release, there were only 10 classes spread across 4 jobs, and one of these original classes stands far above the others in terms of both meta dominance in the early days and overall class popularity throughout MapleStory's entire existence. Today, we're talking about Night Lords. Night Lords were the kings of Old School MapleStory. They were the original Flash Jump class, the original Shadow Partner class, and they always topped the DPS charts in pre-Big Bang MapleStory until they were overshadowed by overpowered new releases. Over the years, they remained one of the most popular classes in the game, which is something that very few classes have been able to achieve consistently. Nowadays, Night Lord is known for their efficient mobbing with skills like Assassin's Mark that will summon throwing stars to hit random enemies, but back in the day, Night Lord was known for quite the opposite, actually. Poor mobbing capabilities plagued the class for a long time, and this was made up for by their crazy DPS in boss fights. Eventually, this weakness was addressed, but what was Night Lord like in Old School MapleStory?
This one's a classic.
It's September 2004, and MapleStory Global just saw its first beta release. Third Job was actively being developed in Korea at this time, so we only had Second Job in the West, and there wasn't a whole lot of content during this era. You could kill things and level up, but with the endgame training areas being the Sleepywood Dungeon, there was only so much to do. Meet Deoxys Rider. He just finished rolling the dice to determine his stats and knows the basics of building a character in OSMS. He makes his way through as many quests as he can find. These are the old days of MapleStory, before guides and before the quest tracker even existed, so this proves to be difficult. He makes his way eventually to level 10 and heads to Kerning City to get his first job advancement. He is now a rogue, our little noob. It was time to begin the grind, but first, he had to learn about his skills. The first job advancement of a Night Lord available at level 10 is the ubiquitous Rogue. Possessing both Lucky 7, a ranged attack, and Double Stab, a melee attack, rogues could build their skills to become either an assassin or a bandit at level 30. In the old days, you weren't able to max all of your skills in a given job advancement like you are nowadays, so you had to pick one path and stick with it. There are 6 skills a rogue has access to, but only a few of them had any kind of impact for a future assassin specifically. First on the list is Nimble Body. This is a passive skill that increases accuracy and avoidability. Useful stats, but most builds opted to level this last after every other important skill was maxed. Assassins never needed the bonus accuracy, but the avoidability would marginally increase their dodge chance, saving valuable potions in the long run. Keen Eyes is the next skill on the list, another passive, but this one gives more range for throwing stars. It's a noticeable increase as well. This is a mandatory pickup for any assassin. You can't skip this one. And if you're a bandit looking to fill the requirements of a ranged attacker in Ludibrium PQ, you can max this as well. With it only requiring 8 points, it's not much of an investment. Now, a skill you can afford to skip on an assassin is Disorder. This is a melee attack debuff skill that reduces an enemy's attack and defense by a small amount. It's not very useful for a ranged assassin, but it does have a mildly interesting story that will be relevant for a certain other class. The only reason to get Disorder on an assassin was to gain access to Darksight. Darksight makes the player immune to physical attacks and will remain active until either the timer runs out or the player uses an attack themselves. Obviously, Darksight is really good, even in the old days. If you've ever played an OSMS rogue, you know this already. This was one of the many tools assassins were given to help their survivability. If Darksight isn't maxed, it will reduce the player's speed by a set value. Very early online databases list that it would reduce speed by 57% at level 1. The earliest files available to us are version 0.40 beta, and within those files, the speed reduction was still only 30%. I thought this little discrepancy was interesting. Perhaps in earlier beta versions that we don't have access to, the speed reduction was still 57%, which is an insane reduction in speed, by the way. Let's just be clear about that. You'd be walking at 43% move speed. The Snail class, everybody! Darksight was a bit of a noob trap. There are multiple guides online stating that you only needed so many levels in the skill and that the speed reduction wasn't a big deal, but this was far from the truth. This speed reduction would overwrite Haste's speed increase, so you absolutely needed to max Darksight so that you didn't have to recast Haste anytime you wanted to use it. And now we finally get to the star of the show, Lucky 7. This skill requires a claw to be equipped and throws 2 stars that have quite the special damage calculations behind them. This skill would be a throwing star rogue's primary attacking skill for a very long time, so not maxing it simply wasn't an option. You had to get it to level 20. This skill holds within it a few secrets that make it incredibly strong. Lucky 7 utilizes a different damage formula than most other forms of attack, and the formula for calculating its damage heavily rewards adding all AP to luck instead of adding any to dex. For this explanation, we'll compare Lucky 7 to a direct competitor, Archer's Double Shot. Damage in OSMS is determined through a series of calculations that generally follow the same steps with variations depending on the skill, weapon, or class behind it. The difference between Lucky 7 and most other skills becomes very apparent in the first step. The biggest difference here is that not only is dex not even considered when calculating maximum or minimum damage for Lucky 7, but it also has a higher primary stat multiplier and its own built-in mastery value. Remember this for the future. While most other classes care about their secondary stat and their mastery and have a smaller multiplier for their main stat within their damage calculations, Assassin just throws those out of the window. There's a reason it's widely considered the best class in Old School MapleStory. This is just one of them. Lucky 7's special traits influence the skill build of an assassin quite a bit, and we'll see more of this when we move into second job. Getting an early value point in Lucky 7 with the skill point received from the first job advancement allows the option to use it, but with most new players being broke, spamming an MP-consuming skill like Lucky 7 simply wasn't an option for a while. A lot of low-level players used their regular attack until the monsters they were killing were consistently giving them a profit in terms of mesos after potion costs. With Lucky 7 costing 8 MP per cast in this era, and MP itself being valued at a minimum of 2 mesos per point, a single Lucky 7 costs 16 mesos to use. This doesn't sound like a lot of money, but with monsters in early first job barely giving more than this per kill, the rogue would need to one-shot most things in order to make even a tiny profit. It's not until the mid-20s or so that using Lucky 7 is consistently profitable, and even then the margins are thin. Getting Keen Eyes as early as possible would benefit the future assassin heavily, as the range increase from this skill made a huge difference in their ability to simply stay away from enemies. It's not a flashy skill or a fun skill, but it's so useful and so important that maxing it first was by far the best choice. Maxing Darksight was not actually commonly done in the early days. Most people overlooked Darksight's impact and instead built Nimble Body first, but it's debatable whether this is optimal or not. 10 extra avoidability is certainly nice, but keeping all of your movement speed after using Darksight was even nicer in my opinion. Our little noob rogue had his build in mind, but he still needed something to throw with that awesome new Garnier he just picked up. There were 14 types of throwing stars available throughout the lifespan of OSMS, with most of them being available as early as the beta release. Deoxys Rider got his hands on the good old reliable Subi throwing stars. Most future assassins used these as their first set of stars, which makes sense given the fact that they were available to purchase for 500 mesos in almost every potion shop throughout the game. They come in sets of 500, and once depleted would stay in the inventory and need to be recharged. Subis were very cheap to recharge, costing on average 0.3 mesos per star. This was a negligible cost even for a brand new player who had no mesos to speak of. Killing a single slime would give the player enough mesos for 63 Subis. There was no consideration of cost for these throwing stars whatsoever. Most claws in OSMS have an attack speed of 4 or 5, with higher level claws usually possessing 4. For whatever reason, the Garnier is the only claw in the game with an attack speed of 6. Don't be confused by this though, this isn't a good thing. In OSMS, the higher the attack speed value, the slower the weapon. This makes the Garnier not only the weakest claw, but also the slowest claw in the game. By level 15, rogues gain access to the Titan line of claws, and these claws have the more reasonable attack speed value of 4. Getting your hands on these claws was difficult though. Even the lowest tier Titans, the Steel Titans, required a steel plate to craft. Steel is a very valuable ore in the world of Old School MapleStory. It's used in multiple crafting recipes, and the ore only drops from 8 monsters on Victoria Island. Low-level claws couldn't be purchased from weapon shops like other types of weapons could. I'm not sure why this is the case, but it makes low-level claws notoriously difficult to get your hands on early. The best way to acquire these claws was by crafting them using ores and various other materials, but this was also prohibitively difficult with the rarity of steel ores. You needed 10 to make 1 steel plate, and the effort it required to get your hands on the materials to craft any other claw just wasn't worth it. That is, until we reached the Meba. This is one of the best claws to ever exist in OSMS. The Meba is a level 25 claw with the fastest attack speed value of any claw in the game of just 3. The Garnier and the Meba are the only 2 claws in the game at this point that don't adhere to the strict 4 or 5 attack speed value that we see in every other claw. Because of a Meba's dominance as one of the best claws, you could use it for quite a long time and it would provide better damage than switching to any other claw. The Meba required 3 steel plates to create, and unless you were willing to purchase one off of another player, this was how you obtained a Meba in the beta days. There was no other way to get one. They dropped from Copper Drakes, so I guess you could train they're level 45 enemies? Okay, so you can't yet. The Meba is actually a direct upgrade of the Garnier. They have a similar design, and a Garnier is required to craft a Meba. Interesting little fact. Our future assassin makes his way through first job, acquiring the usual gear you would find on a throwing star rogue in 2004. A brown bamboo hat, his Meba, some white bottom shoes, and full level 30 gear. At level 30, Deoxys Rider talks to the Dark Lord, who informs him that he has to find the thief job instructor somewhere around Kerning City. After finding this thief job instructor, Deoxys Rider is put through a test that requires him to collect 30 dark marbles from special monsters. After collecting these dark marbles, he's given a necklace as proof of his completion of the test and returns to the Dark Lord to choose his path. Rogues are given the option to job advance to either an assassin or a bandit, and since this is a video discussing Night Lord, Deoxys Rider chose bandit. I'm just kidding, he chose assassin. I do not set out to make the funniest jokes of all time, they just happen. Reaching this point gives our newly advanced assassin access to 6 more skills, with most of them being passives that a lot of other classes also get. Normally, classes wanted to immediately max weapon mastery in second job, or at least get it to level 19 for the full mastery bonus. As we know, an assassin's main attack ignored mastery calculations and had its own built-in mastery. Alongside this, luck, an assassin's main stat, gave more than enough accuracy to hit every enemy they needed to hit at the appropriate level. This meant assassins never wanted to build mastery first, and they were the only class who could skip it and not lose out on damage. This skill was technically completely unnecessary for an assassin, though the increase in the number of throwing stars held per slot was nice enough of a perk that they'd come back later to max this skill. Assassin's second skill is Critical Throw. This skill passively gives the assassin a chance to crit, one of only 3 classes in the game at this point with this innate ability. It contributed a huge amount to an assassin's damage, but was often pretty underrated because of the next skill on this list. We all know Haste. This skill is iconic. Haste is a party buff that assassins and bandits receive that increases the party's speed and jump to the soft caps. It was possible to easily reach 123% jump with a scrolled pair of shoes and haste, which was actually the soft cap, and I'm not sure why haste stopped at 120%. A lot of assassins and bandits alike fell victim to the allure of this skill, opting to max it early instead of their more useful and impactful skills. It was too enticing. The ability to jump to the 3rd sewer opening in Kerning City at will, but it wasn't the best idea to max it first on an assassin. While it did have a significant impact on an assassin's ability to grind, this impact wasn't felt as heavily as other skills that contributed more. It felt nice to be able to move faster, and it did have an impact, so it's understandable that people would often go haste over critical throw. But the increased damage from critical throw would allow assassins to two-shot enemies more comfortably and earlier than their haste leveling peers. It's debatable which one is actually better, but I'm firmly in the critical throw first camp, if that wasn't obvious. Endure is an interesting skill. It allows the assassin to passively recover more HP and MP every 10 seconds. It's actually a great skill in the early game, allowing players to recover without the need of potions, but it requires too much investment and simply doesn't outshine other skills, so Endure was often overlooked by assassins. By the time they had their core skills maxed, Endure would have fallen off in usefulness, so it would be skipped in favor of more useful skills. Next is Claw Booster, which is very straightforward. It's a buff skill that increases the attack speed on an equipped claw by 2. Because of the Maba's existence, this skill was not as high of a priority as one might initially think. The hard cap for attack speed in this era was 2 and the Maba had 3. It was close enough to the cap that Claw Booster wasn't a high priority skill to acquire until you had at least a few levels in critical throw. Oh, there it is again. Oh, talking about the Togain loves critical throw. And we have Drain as the last skill in an assassin's kit. This skill is the only reason assassins would ever add points into Endure, as level 3 was required to unlock Drain. This skill absorbs an enemy's HP based on the damage dealt, and it was such a useful skill that assassins would use it all the way until level 200. It saved potions. It wasn't reliable enough of a heal to replace potions entirely, like we see with Cleric's heal, but it was a good fallback option regardless. An optimal build for an assassin is a bit more complex than the rogue build. Upon getting the second job advancement, the assassin is given 1 skill point, and this goes into mastery to begin the process of unlocking critical throw. At level 31, 2 more points are added to mastery, and the last point is added to critical throw. From here until level 38, all points are added into critical throw, but this doesn't quite max it out. The only reason to not finish maxing it is to get a few points in booster, which then allows the assassin to switch from a Maba to an Avarice, the level 40 claw, without losing any attack speed, since the Avarice has 4 base. Critical throw is then finished and haste is maxed next. Level 6 booster gives a minute of increased attack speed, and while it sucks to have to recast a buff every minute, haste definitely has more of an impact than a longer duration of booster would. Luckily, once haste is maxed at level 50, booster can be maxed immediately after it. Mastery is then maxed, and this is almost exclusively for the bonus throwing stars per slot. Endure is leveled to 3 to unlock Drain, and the last 28 points are added to Drain, making it a very useful utility skill for assassins. This obviously isn't the only way you can build an assassin. It's the way I would do it personally, as I believe this is the most optimal route, but it's not a terrible idea to finish maxing critical throw before putting points into booster, and we'll see this become more standard after a certain meta shift in version 23. Now that Deoxys Rider is level 30 and understands his second job skills, he's looking to make some upgrades. He notices that the level 30 claws have an attack speed of fast instead of faster like his Maba, so he opts to buy scrolls to upgrade his current claw instead of switching to a different one. It makes more sense at this point to just slowly upgrade a Maba with 100% attack scrolls than it does to switch to a slower claw entirely. Deoxys Rider is so rich at this point from his numerous KPQ runs after all. What was he possibly planning to do with all of this cash? The next tier of throwing stars, just above the reliable old Subies, were the Snowballs and Wolby throwing stars. Snowballs dropped exclusively from Lupins, but without the iconic Monkey Forest 2 map layout that hunters loved, Lupins were not that popular. Snowballs were very rare, if they were even obtainable during the beta. They were in the files, but without any databases or references for this time period, it's hard to know for certain. Wolbies, on the other hand, dropped from Fireboars, a commonly trained on monster, and were often the first new set of stars someone would find. Recharging Snowballs costs 1 meso per star, and recharging Wolbies costs 0.4 mesos per star. These values still aren't significant, though if you were running Snowballs from level 10, you'd find that the cost would actually make a difference when compared to the much cheaper Subies. Snowballs also held 800 stars per slot, whereas Subies and Wolbies both held only 500 per slot. This was an important consideration to make as well, especially during the early days where inventory slots were at an extreme premium. Above the tier of snowballs and wool bee, we find wooden tops and mock bee throwing stars. Wooden tops dropped from dark axe stumps exclusively, and mock bees could be farmed from a variety of monsters. Junior wraiths, cold eyes, and stone golems to be precise. The wooden tops were rarer and held 100 extra stars per slot, but they both have the same attack value. Neither of these stars were considered very good, a stepping stone for an early game assassin and not much more. After shopping around a bit, Deoxys Rider gets his hands on 4 sets of mock bee throwing stars, increasing his throwing star damage bonus from +15 to +19, which is a solid improvement. At level 40, after a very time-consuming grind and with his new claw booster skill, he shops around and finds the materials he needs to craft a steel avarice, the first claw upgrade that's worth anything after the Meba. He grinds at wild boars, fire boars, eventually he moves up to copper drakes and finds a few above-average Mebas to sell at a massive profit. With these mesos, he manages to get his hands on a new tier of throwing stars, replacing his old mock bees. These are icicles, commonly referred to as ices. They exclusively dropped from cold eyes, and with cold eyes being a nuisance enemy that dominated the spawns of certain endgame training maps of the time, there were a lot of these available for a good price. Humby throwing stars are almost on the same level as icicles, possessing the same attack value, but they still managed to fall short in the icicle-dominated meta. Humbies were a very hard sell, with them holding 200 stars less than mock bees and ices being so abundantly available within the same tier. With his new sets of ices in hand, he's feeling stronger than ever. Training on copper drakes allows him access to their dragon skin drop, and using these along with other materials, he crafts himself a steel slain, a level 50 claw. But this would be the last claw he was able to craft from scratch. The final claw above this tier of level 50 claws were the Gigantics. In fact, only 32 claws even existed in the files during this era, so getting your hands on a Dark Gigantic was a huge accomplishment, one that Deoxys Rider had his eyes set on. This was his final goal, and he wanted to accomplish it before the beta concluded. He got back to the grind, training at Drakes, and eventually moving on to the Sleepywood dungeon to train at Wild Cargoes to begin gathering the materials he'd need, as well as a chance at an upgraded throwing star drop. Toby throwing stars are a step above ices and are generally considered the acceptable mid to late game option. They possess +23 weapon attack, holding 1000 per slot and costing 0.6 mesos per star to recharge. A fantastic upgrade over ices. In the beta, these dropped from Darkstone Golems and Wild Cargoes. He managed to pick up a few sets of both Tobies and ices, finding himself nearly level 70 after a few more weeks of grinding. He knew now that he must take on the strongest enemies in MapleStory, Taro Maces and Taro Spears. These were the highest level monsters available during the beta, and Taro Spears specifically held the bronze gigantic drop that he needed in order to craft the Dark Gigantic Claw. The bronze gigantic could not be crafted by JM from the streets. He didn't have the knowledge to create one from scratch, only the knowledge to upgrade them, and killing Taro Spears was the only way to get one. During this drawn-out war against the Taro Spears, Deoxys Rider would find himself occasionally retreating to Red Drakes to recover the mesos he would spend grinding in the Sleepywood dungeon. During one of these recovery trips, he found a new set of stars that he had previously only heard tales of, Steelies. What were effectively best-in-slot stars for an assassin during this era, Steely throwing stars dropped from both Red Drakes and Taro Maces. With these being some of the best endgame training options of the time, these stars weren't hard to come by. Deoxys Rider was able to get a couple sets, but because his prize was locked behind Taro Spears and not the Taro Maces who dropped Steelies, he didn't have a chance to get them unless he was at Red Drakes. But there was yet one more set of stars that was even rarer and more costly than Steelies, the only set that was truly difficult to farm, Ilbees. These exclusively dropped from Mushmom, with Mushmom having anywhere between a 45-minute to 60-minute respawn time, coupled with the fact that if you changed channels while in the map, you'd be returned to Hinnesis and have to walk back, plus the fact that everyone was camping it. Getting a set of Ilbees was nearly impossible during this era. They existed, they weren't unobtainable, but they were so far out of reach that they were mostly a legend during the beta era. With Ilbies holding such prestige, it didn't even matter that you were losing out on 200 stars per slot compared to Steelies, but this was a good argument for Steely dominance during this era. Why do I need the rare Ilbies when Steelies hold more per slot anyway, huh? Answer me that, Nexon. Eventually, Deoxys Rider got what he was looking for, the Bronze Gigantic. Toro Spears drop one of the other ingredients required for crafting the Dark Gigantic, so he was set to have JM from the streets upgrade his new claw, completing his goal. Your average endgame assassin would look something like this in the beta era of MapleStory, and only be in their mid-80s. Deoxys Rider had done it. He'd become one of the strongest assassins in the game and achieved every goal he ever wanted to achieve. He knew there was more he could do, more goals he could accomplish, but it was at this point that Nexon decided to officially launch GMS, wiping all data in the process. The official release introduced Osiria, which includes El Nath and everything that came with it. One of the big improvements for an assassin was the fact that lycanthropes were added to the game, and they had Ilbies in their drop table. They were still a slow-spawning, hard-to-kill monster, but this made Ilbies farmable from something that wasn't an area boss. Victoria Island monsters remained unchanged, but the release of Osiria's cat mobs gave low-level assassins a decent training spot with monsters who could drop good throwing stars and 60% claw attack scrolls. Any of these three were a solid choice to grind on, all offering something that you couldn't get elsewhere alongside decent EXP. Junior kitties were a very popular training spot for a lot of classes for a very long time. Their seniors didn't exactly offer as much to an assassin, except for the groupins who could drop both Tobies and Ices. But after level 50, players would be allowed access to Deep El Nath, the dungeon of El Nath that contained zombies. Zombies are an absolutely iconic OSMS monster. They still exist nowadays, but they're basically pointless. Back in this era, however, and for a long time, zombies would be the best monster to grind on for just about every class in the game for a huge level range. Assassins thrived here with their high mobility, but zombies had really poor drops. The most useful things they dropped for an assassin were the Bronze Identity and the level 70 bronze armor pieces. Since assassins were using dex during this era as they needed it for their claws, these were still considered good drops. This second job era with Osiria and El Nath didn't last very long though. 7 months after release, third job would find its way to GMS, and assassins would see some of the best upgrades a class could possibly get. Version 14 was the release of third job. Assassins who reached level 70 and completed their third job advancement quest could become a hermit. Hermits are the iconic MapleStory class. As kids, a lot of us saw high-level hermits like Tangden 275 and thought they were the coolest class ever. The aesthetics, the speed, but even beyond that, hermits are given so many useful skills, it's actually ridiculous. First on the list of ridiculous skills that no class ever needs for any reason but was given to hermits because they're Nexon's favorite child and everyone else had to deal with not having it despite its sheer power that caused quite an imbalance within the meta, was Alchemist. This is a passive skill that at max level gives any potion consumed 150% of its recovery, and if it has a buff effect, it gives it 150% duration. This means that a white potion would heal 450 HP instead of 300. Warrior potions would last 4.5 minutes instead of 3. Unagi would heal 1500 HP instead of 1000, etc. Alchemist doesn't apply to percent-based recovery items like elixirs, so I guess they drew the line there. Yeah, don't want to make the class overpowered, right? As if having potions that were 50% more effective on a hermit than on any other class wasn't enough, hermits also get an active buff that increases the amount of mesos dropped by monsters by 50%. This likely existed to help hermits not spend so many mesos on potions alongside Alchemist, but I don't see why they needed both. At the very least, this was a party skill, so it could benefit everyone, but this now makes two incredibly useful supportive skills that a hermit has. This is the best DPS class in the game, by the way. Don't forget that part. Shadow Partner, another iconic skill that was eventually given to other classes throughout various updates. Again, we find that Hermit was the only class who had the privilege of Shadow Partner in the early days. If you used a skill like Lucky 7, Shadow Partner would mimic its attacks with 50% of its damage. Lucky 7, being a 2-hit attack, becomes a 4-hit attack, with the last 2 hits dealing exactly half of what the first 2 hits dealt. Shadow Partner had this effect on just about every attack a Hermit could use, and if you used a normal attack, Shadow Partner would mimic it with 80% of the damage instead of just 50%. This skill required a summoning rock to use, and these could be obtained from an NPC after completing a series of quests. This quest line was quite long and required a lot of traveling. It was tied to the character and not account-wide, and it had a level requirement of 55, making it very time-consuming to create a mule who could buy the rocks for you. Most Hermits would have to go all the way back to El Nath when they ran out of summoning rocks. Finally, something annoying that Hermits had to deal with along with everyone else in the game. Except for the fact that every single Hermit in the game at this point was grinding in El Nath already and could have a priest door them back to restock when necessary. Shadow Partner had a very long cast animation, one of the longest in the game. If Shadow Partner was cast on a rope or ladder instead of on the ground, it wouldn't be able to play the entire character animation, so it would shorten the cast time significantly. This is the reason you often see Hermits cast Shadow Partner on ropes or ladders. It's way faster. Shadow Web is an interesting skill that only finds use in very niche situations. It will stun any enemy it hits at an 80% success rate, damaging it over time. This damage does 3.3% of the monster's HP every number of seconds. I couldn't find concrete information on the actual tick rate. This is a slightly underrated utility skill that not only regular Hermits, but also certain odd job classes want to have. You won't find much use for it, but it's a cool skill. What do you get the class who has everything? Just give them one of the only binds in the game, I don't know. At least it didn't affect bosses. Shadow Meso might be the single most overlooked skill that a Hermit has received by this point. That's not to say it's a good skill. It had some use in certain scenarios if you found yourself running out of stars, but it was poorly designed. At max level, it uses a random amount of mesos in place of a single throwing star and has a 10% chance to deal an extra 50% damage, giving it 5% more damage on average. This single attack is doubled by Shadow Partner, making it weirdly a somewhat useful attacking skill if you ran out of stars, needed to do damage, and couldn't recharge. Looks cool though. Reminds me of Galder Throw from Trickster Online. Who remembers that game? Flash Jump. We all know that in modern MapleStory, every class has either a flash jump or a teleport skill for mobility, with the coolest class Kaiser having both, but in OSMS, Hermits and Magicians were the only ones given this luxury. Again, flash jump exists for 2 reasons: survivability and mobility. It can get you out of a pinch if used correctly, and allows you to reposition very quickly, which is important for a squishy ranged character. Couple this with haste, and a Hermit's movement capabilities far surpass any other class in the game at this point. The last important skill to cover is Avenger. This is a mobbing skill, and there's not much to say about it. It's the only mobbing skill Hermits received at this point. It's pretty good, but it's not great. It consumed 3 stars per cast, but this didn't matter too much since Hermits would try to only use it when attacking 3 or more enemies, giving it far more efficiency than Lucky 7 overall. Hermits were really the 1v1 masters, and this was the majority of their talents. Avenger not being a great mobbing skill didn't matter much, it still got the job done whenever it needed to. As we saw in the race to 200, there were a lot of Night Lords in the top 5 at various points, but we never saw a Chief Bandit or an Archer in the top 5 despite those classes possessing technically superior mobbing capabilities. Building a third job character in this early era of the game was quite the arduous task. Every level took some time, and you only saw minuscule improvements to your skills with each level. It was truly the epitome of growth. Nothing was handed to you, and you really had to be patient and dedicated to reach legendary status as a third job character during this time. Hermits were very strong, and there's not much more to be said about them. Simply giving a Hermit access to Shadow Partner would increase their grinding speed by a significant amount. Hermits and Assassins alike were grinding away in El Nath since the official release. From Junior Yetis to Zombies, Yeti and Pepes for the Steelies and Bronze Gigantic drops, Lycanthropes for the Ilby drop, Cerubs for the new best-in-slot Dark Scarab drop. Any high-level monster was being trained on by someone at some point, but things would change in version 19. Once Ludibrium was released with the version 19 update, Gatekeepers became available and they held access to the next best-in-slot claw, the Black Mamba. This claw being best-in-slot was a bit unfortunate actually. It gave bonus dex, whereas all of the other best-in-slot claws up until now gave bonus luck. Not every single claw in the game gave luck, but if it gave dex, it was ignored, as most claws were recolors of the other claws in that tier and could be replaced with a different color claw. The Black Mamba wasn't the first claw to not have any counterparts within its tier, but it was the highest attack claw and the only option. Ludibrium was a big change for everyone, but the impact it had on hermits specifically was interesting. Grinding at Gatekeepers or Thanatos was usually done by the higher level players looking for specific items, and you'd often see hermits grinding at Spirit Vikings instead. These are some of the most iconic deep looty monsters. Within their drop table, they held both the Dark Scarab and the Ilby Throwing Star drops. A pretty good start, but they also had a weird quirk with their design that benefited ranged classes exclusively. Spirit Vikings have a ranged projectile attack that hits very hard, enough to one-shot a low-level hermit. But when they fire this projectile attack to the left, the hitbox ends prematurely. This means that the range that Spirit Vikings would seek out before firing would be too short to actually hit anything if the player was standing to their left. This effectively gave ranged classes a safe zone where they were invincible. This was the case for multiple monsters who attacked in this fashion during this era, and it was abused by hermits quite a bit. With deep looty maps having so many platforms and so much space, even if Spirit Vikings didn't have this glitch with their projectiles, they were still a very strong training option for a hermit because of the sheer range that throwing stars had with keen eyes. They didn't need to abuse this bug to make use of all of the tiny platforms that were outside of the Spirit Vikings attack range, though the bug did help a lot. Elnath was still a favored grinding spot during this era, but with Spirit Vikings offering so much for what was considered an endgame hermit, it wasn't a difficult transition. Grinding at Spirit Vikings was tough for sure, but in order to reach that point during this era, you would have had to have already put in a lot of time on a squishy hermit, meaning most endgame hermits were pretty damn good at their job already. It was around this time that we would see a shift in the meta for the class as a whole, though it would specifically impact the low-level assassins the most at first. Even in the beta, people were already well aware that Dex was nothing more than a necessary evil. You had to add points to it, or you'd be stuck using a level 10 claw for your whole career. That's crazy, right? No way the lowest level weapon could be best in slot. No, get out of here, luckless magicians. I'm not talking about you yet. So let's talk about Dexless assassins. What are they? Well, to answer that question, we need to go over a few things. In Old School MapleStory, most classes required 2 stats to equip their gear, and every class is given 5 points per level to allocate to their stats as they see fit. The general idea of a character's stats is to have a main stat and a secondary stat, both of which contribute to the character's damage, with the primary stat holding more weight. This was the case from beta in September 2004 until the first part of the Tempest update in July 2012. An assassin's secondary stat is Dex, so a Dexless assassin is exactly what it sounds like, an assassin who doesn't add any points to Dex. This is sort of a misnomer, however, because every thief, whether they like it or not, has to have a certain amount of Dex. 25 was required to become a rogue in the first place. Even if you tried using an AP reset scroll on your Dex after job advancing, you were not allowed to go below 25. But this restriction didn't really matter. It's not like they struggled to outdamage every single other class in the game by this point anyway. Every class benefits heavily from not adding points into their secondary stat, but because of a few odd design choices, Assassin is one of the classes who benefits the most. The thing is, they didn't exist until now. Every hermit was building their stats normally, enough dex to equip an endgame claw, and everything else would be added to luck. This allowed them to easily equip gear appropriate for their level, and this was normal. Version 23 was the first anniversary event, introducing the level 35 and 43 maple weapons, the Maple Claw and the Maple Candayo. This changed everything about the class. Lucky 7, not relying on Dex for any of its damage calculations, only doubled down on the lack of incentive to ever add points to Dex after these claws were released. These are two of the elements that influenced the dominance of a Dexless Hermit. A well-scrolled Condayo with a Dexless build would beat out a regular build Hermit for a massive portion of the game. Without any higher level claws, the Black Mamba is more or less on par with a Maple Condayo in terms of damage output, if we allow ourselves some wiggle room with regards to gearing up a character. Dexless builds would fall off eventually with only the level 43 claw available, so it was not a safe long-term build quite yet. But if there's one thing to take away from this, it's that Rob TC13 was very unhappy with Dexless Assassins. Be aware of that as you watch this video. If you make a Dexless Assassin and he sees you, you will be getting defamed. More importantly, with version 23, we saw the release of Zachem and level 90 weapons. While Zachem brought the expected Zachem helmet, this also meant that we had a new best-in-slot claw, the Casters. These would drop exclusively from Zachem, and they had the stats that you would expect. For some reason, Nexon gave this claw Dex as well. I don't know what the reasoning was. It doesn't contribute anything at all to a Hermit's damage. You have to have the 130 Dex required to equip the Casters in the first place, so it's not like they were contributing to their own requirement. It's so weird that they did this for these weapons. Hermits were the primary DPS for Zachem at this time, actually for most of OSMS's lifespan and also for most bosses. They were one of only 3 classes who could hit Zachem's top right arm with any sort of reasonable damage. The Zachem helmet was a massive increase for a Hermit, as it was for most classes. The extra 15 Dex on average made Hermits much stronger, since they then have 15 free AP to use on luck. Add this to the plus 15 luck that also came with the hat, and low Dex Hermits had a net gain of plus 30 luck from this one equip alone. Zachem helmets from this point onward became the new best-in-slot helmet for every single class in the game. Version 28 was the release of Aqua Road's Deep Gorge, bringing with it new mid- and end-game training areas. Gobies were a solid option for Hermits, but because of the tight timing required to hit them all with Avenger after destroying the bombing fish house and the chaos that would ensue if you didn't hit that timing, which would allow them to swim around freely, Hermits more frequently grinded at squids, which was a far more relaxing experience. This was the best EXP available, but the drops weren't great. The Ristle squids had a chance to drop glove attack 60% scrolls, so there was a ray of hope within the darkness of Deep Gorge. These are some of my favorite maps in the game, by the way. They're just so nice. Cozy, you could say. During this era, we saw the addition of Zombie Mushmom, who had a new best-in-slot set of stars on its drop table, the Hwabi Throwing Stars. These are identical to Ilbi's in most ways, the only difference being that they hold 1,000 per slot and cost 1 meso per star to recharge. These were technically superior, but they were quite a bit more expensive since they only dropped from Zombie Mushmom. During this era, Steelies were still the most cost-effective option for the overwhelming majority of Hermits. Maple Throwing Stars were made available around this time as well, but I could not find much information on where they were from. The only information I have is that they were probably available from the Ludibrium PQ bonus stage. People look back on these stars fondly, but I don't remember seeing them very often. They were either very rare or very underutilized. Maybe both. Pink Adventurer capes also appeared in the game during this era. These are the first capes in the game that came with weapon attack clean. We'd see a few more added after this, but the Pink Adventurer cape is by far the most iconic of them. Even 2 weapon attack, the average value, would be enough of an increase in damage that they'd beat out most other capes that weren't well scrolled. You could get as much as plus 15 dex from a cape, even if this amount was hard to reach, requiring 5 upgrades from a 30% or 10% scroll. You could also scroll a Pink Adventurer cape in this manner, there was nothing stopping anyone from doing so, but as we'll learn soon, you didn't want to do this to these capes. Some of the last content we see during this era is the release of Amoria and subsequently the release of Amoria PQ. If you saw my PQ retrospective video, you might remember that Amoria PQ's primary reward were Onyx Apples, one of the most overpowered buff items ever released in GMS. Plus 100 weapon attack for 10 minutes was already really good, but with Alchemist, a Hermit could make a single Onyx Apple last 15 minutes. These Onyx apples increased a Hermit's DPS by a significant amount. Weapon attack is favored so heavily in a Hermit's damage calculations, which is one of the reasons their base attack power on weapons is so low. Adding a raw 100 weapon attack to the formula makes them absolute DPS machines. Onyx apples could stack in your inventory just fine, and nobody was carrying around more than 100 of them, so the duration increase from Alchemist ultimately just made a very valuable item even more valuable on a class that was already topping the DPS charts with ease. And that was the birth of the Dexless Assassin. People started debating Dexless builds versus normal builds around this time. The lack of complete information led the community to believe that Dexless was superior and more expensive. While these aren't necessarily incorrect statements, the differences between the two are a lot smaller the further on you get through the game. A Dexless Assassin will absolutely crush a normal build assassin, but once you reach level 100 plus, the difference is tiny. Still, from this point onwards, we'd see a huge number of Dexless Assassins, and this outfit became the look. Version 40 launched GMS into a new era, the New Leaf City era. You might think that since Hermit's Alchemist skill didn't affect percent-based potions, that they didn't feel as much of an impact from the extremely overpowered percent-based potions we received with NLC. Unfortunately, that analysis would be incorrect. NLC also brought a lot of overpowered regular potions that Alchemist would affect, so even Hermits still got a lot of benefit from NLC's existence. NLC also added a few very strong buff potions, but these weren't as egregiously overpowered as something like ginger ales or mana bowls. A warrior elixir from NLC added 12 weapon attack for 8 minutes, 12 minutes with Alchemist. This was basically a second pair of attack work gloves, which was very welcome for a hermit. New Leaf City overall brought with it a lot of overpowered things. One of these overpowered additions were the monsters known as wolf spiders. These monsters are only notable for a hermit because of their Ilby throwing star drop. Yet another new monster holding the best in slot stars in their drop table. Wolf spiders were difficult for a hermit to train on. They moved fast, hit hard, and there were a lot of them in a somewhat awkward map layout that didn't favor ranged attackers. Wolf spiders were a better choice for other classes, but they still flooded the market with Ilbys regardless. Speaking of throwing stars, there's a set of throwing stars that we haven't discussed yet. They were in the files for a long time and were maybe obtainable from some obscure source I don't know about, but Hime's dropped the orange throwing stars, and this was when they became known by the player base at large. They gave plus 20 attack, matching the paper fighter planes that were added much later on. This is a tier of stars in between Machby and Cumby, and with them both holding 1,000 stars per slot, they were actually a great mid-game choice. They were even better than Icy's potentially, depending on how much you value one weapon attack over 200 extra stars. With endgame players grinding away at Hime's, it wasn't too difficult to find a set of these for sale in the free market. Only a few updates later, the Haunted House was released. With the Haunted House, we received voodoo enemies who dropped Heartstoppers. These little candies gave plus 60 weapon attack, but only lasted 1 minute. Oh, sorry, I meant 1 minute and 30 seconds. For hermits. These were good burst buffs, but because they were so easily farmable from voodoos, a monster that a lot of classes wanted to grind on, including assassins and some low-level hermits, it wasn't unreasonable for a hermit to use Heartstoppers throughout an entire Zakum fight. You'd only be using 45 per hour after all, and don't forget about the cancel weapon attack phase of the bodies, so probably not a full 45 per hour. Stormcaster gloves were added shortly after as well, the ITCG exclusive gloves that have 5 slots and come clean with 5 weapon attack. These became the new best in slot gloves for any non-magician. Magicians would get their best in slot a bit later on. I don't think I need to state the obvious here, but Stormcaster gloves were ridiculously good. The average attack glove up until this point was either 8 or 10 attack, but Stormcaster gloves introduced a way to get 13 or 15 attack work gloves without even needing to use a single 30% or 10% scroll. Very strong, very iconic. The final update in the New Leaf City era was the release of the Shinobi Bracer and the Neva. The Shinobi Bracer is a level 55 claw that has 28 base weapon attack, which became the new best in slot Dexless claw, further closing the gap between Dexless builds and normal builds. The ITCG exclusive Neva actually had 2 more base weapon attack and only required level 50, but was harder to come by due to the fact that it had to be crafted with ITCG items. Both of these claws were used from this era onwards, but the Shinobi Bracer was by far the more popular of the two. Now we leave the New Leaf City era and find ourselves confronted with the reality of 4th Job. Version 49 was the release of 4th Job, the final job advancement in pre-Big Bang MapleStory. As we know, hermits are already incredibly powerful. Their repertoire lends itself so well to a selfish DPS playstyle, and you'd think 4th Job would add a lot to it. You'd mostly be right about that, but 4th Job wasn't as overpowered as 3rd Job. Between Shadow Partner, Alchemist, Meso Up, and Flash Jump, but it was enough of a boost that it allowed Night Lords to continue their dominance over the OSMS meta even after every other class was brought up by 4th Job's release. Maple Warrior is a common 4th Job skill that all classes get. It's a weird skill because it still exists in modern MapleStory, but it's completely unchanged. This skill was the first instance of Nexon attempting to implement percent-based stats, and it was clearly such a perfect skill that it never needed refining. I'm not even sure if I'm joking about that or not. Maple Warrior has an interesting quirk with it that amplifies the effectiveness of the Dexless build even further. Let's say Deoxys Rider has level 20 Maple Warrior, which is an increase of 10% to all stats. He also has 200 total luck, 100 base luck, and another 100 from equipment. Maple Warrior will only increase his luck by 10 in this case, even though it should increase it by 20. This is because Maple Warrior only affects base stats. Because of this quirk, 4th Job's release saw even further incentive for a Night Lord to have as little dex as they possibly could to maximize their luck, and therefore their damage. While this wasn't technically the birth of the low dex build, it catapulted it into meta status, leaving behind regular full dex builds completely. Low dex, of course, simply being maximizing your dex bonus from equips so that you can wear high-level gear without investing too many points into dex. This eventually became the standard for Night Lords, though a lot of players would continue to hold on to their dexless status. Next is Shadow Shifter. This is a passive, common 4th Job skill for thieves that gives a 30% chance to avoid any attack. That's all it does, but alongside higher recovery, naturally high avoidability, grinding with Meso Up, and longer buff item times, Night Lords had a ton of tools to mitigate the usual Meso expense associated with playing the class. And it was very welcome. Night Lords were expensive, but do they really need all of these? Another common 4th Job skill for thieves is Ninja Ambush. This is a weird skill. When you use it, it targets enemies within its range and basically applies a damage over time effect on them. Ninja Ambush won't kill enemies, leaving them at 1 HP instead, so it has a few unique, extremely niche uses for luring monsters towards you so you take their hits instead of the big boss's attacks. Like Onego, I guess. I don't think most people used this skill, it was too niche. Yet another common 4th Job thief skill, Venom. This is the star variant, and this is another easily forgettable skill. It's somewhat iconic, being a damage over time effect just like Ninja Ambush, but it didn't work on bosses in its first implementation, so Night Lords really didn't care very much about it. Most of a Night Lord's life after 4th Job is bossing with a little bit of grinding sprinkled in, only as a treat. Ninja Storm is a decent skill. 4th Job wasn't only mediocre Night Lord skills. Similar to something like Power Knockback, Ninja Storm will quickly push enemies away from the player with a set success rate, 100% at max level. Instead of the Night Lord having to run away from monsters to reposition, they were now able to push the monsters away at will. Now, the first really good skill that Night Lords receive is Triple Throw. This is nothing more than an upgraded Lucky 7 that throws 3 stars instead of 2. This skill was locked behind Zachem, being one of the skill books it could drop. This meant that the Night Lord would either have to get a carry or clear Zachem before being allowed access to Triple Throw. Triple Throw shares the same damage formula as Lucky 7. This means mastery doesn't matter at any point in a Night Lord's career. Avenger would be the only attack that's commonly used that might see a difference with mastery, but with that being a 3rd Job skill, you'd already have max mastery by the time you get it. This also means that Dex is still not considered whatsoever at any point. Dexless Night Lords win again. You could make the argument that simply giving Night Lords this one skill makes them so good that they wouldn't need anything else, but they yet received more. A lot more. Let's take a look at Shadow Stars, for example. Between potions, buffs, and throwing stars, keeping a Night Lord stocked with useful bossing items could get very cluttered. Shadow Stars is a buff that allows the Night Lord to use an unlimited amount of stars for a set period of time, 2 minutes at max level. Its impact wasn't felt in terms of mesos saved from recharging stars, but rather in allowing the Night Lord to simply have to recharge less often. They could grind or boss for longer periods of time, and this is what made this skill so great. Next we have Taunt. This is another 4th job common skill for thieves that can be used on an enemy to give it increased defense, EXP, and item drop rate. A very cool skill, though it didn't work on bosses, so it was only for grinding. Night Lord's last skill is Sharp Eyes. This skill increased a Night Lord's damage by such a huge amount, so it's a good thing they had this in their kit. What? That's not a Night Lord skill? Okay, so I was just informed Sharp Eyes is actually a common 4th job archer skill. It's a party buff that increases crit rate and crit damage. It was so important for a Night Lord's damage, and with Night Lord being one of the most popular classes, it made Bowmasters and Marksmen extremely sought after by proxy once 4th job was released. Yes, me mentioning this in the section discussing Night Lord's skills is intentional. Sharp Eyes had by far the most impact on a Night Lord's damage when compared with any other class in the game, so I wanted to bring it up. 4th job completely changed the balance of the game, or most of the other classes at least. Hermit was nearly on top before, and now Night Lords were comfortably on top in most ways, except for their grinding capabilities, which were just okay. One of the major meta shifts that came with 4th job was the release of Magician Ultimates. If you couple these overpowered full map attacks with the ridiculously overpowered, cheap, percent-based potions we got from NLC, we have the birth of leeching. And of course, leeching leads into HP washing. We finally made it, the discussion we've all been anticipating. HP washing in Old School MapleStory. It applies heavily to Night Lords, as their squishiness was one of the only weaknesses they had. Being able to mitigate or even entirely circumvent this weakness was another contributing factor to their dominance over the OSMS meta. I went over what HP washing is in my iceberg video. How it relates specifically to Night Lords, though, requires a bit more explanation. Just so we're on the same page, HP washing is the name of a strategy that allowed players to acquire a much higher max HP value than that which was intended by the design of the class. By leveling up with extra int on any character, you would get that int value divided by 10 added to your MP pool. Every class in OSMS has a formula that determines their minimum MP, the amount they can never go under. Using an AP reset scroll, you can reset the extra MP you have over that minimum value and convert it into HP. The actual method of doing this doesn't matter for our purposes. All that matters is that for thieves, every 12 MP you have over the minimum formula can be turned into anywhere between 16 and 20 HP. The actual value is random, averaging 18. Because of this conversion, it's possible for a Night Lord to reach the hard cap of 30,000 HP, but I don't think anyone in GMS ever bothered doing this. The cost would be at least $7,200 to accomplish this pointless endeavor, and probably a figure much higher than that in reality. Instead, it was far more common to incidentally HP wash, as I call it. When characters receive a job advancement, they get a certain amount of bonus HP and MP. The excess MP from this is actually sufficient, coupled with some good int equips, to reach the value that a lot of players wanted. I found conflicting information on the exact value, but most sources say it's somewhere around 5,000 base HP that was required to survive Horntail. Most classes were able to HP wash with this bonus job advancement MP just fine, using HP equips to make up the difference, and join in on boss runs before level 200 where they'd have just barely enough HP to survive without any washing. Only a few players really dove into the HP washing strategy too heavily, as it was expensive and unfun. HP washing was not prevalent in OSMS, and I can't stress this enough. The costs associated with it in terms of USD, mesos, and time was more than enough to deter anyone from trying it. Most HP washing you would see in the old days came from incidental washing with bonus job advancement MP, or from warriors who wanted to min-max really hard. It was very easy to HP wash on a warrior after all. A Night Lord who tried to HP wash too heavily would be unable to play the game, as their damage would be so low that they'd basically be useless. Their inability to kill things was made up for with leeching, but we'll save that discussion for another time. Fourth job's release included an entirely new endgame area that came with it, Leafree. With Leafree, Night Lords received a new best-in-slot claw, the Red Craven. The Red Craven again widened the gap between Dexless and low Dex, but with the Shinobi Bracer's existence, the difference between the two builds was still microscopic. A Night Lord could choose to go either route and be just fine. We got a couple new sets of throwing stars during this era as well. The first of these are the Crystal Ilbies. These have plus 29 attack, beating regular Ilbies and Huabies, which were the highest tier option until now. Crystal Ilbies didn't drop from any monster though. They're GMS exclusive throwing stars that require items that came only from the ITCG cards to craft. With no downsides and a higher attack bonus, Crystal Ilbies immediately became the most popular throwing stars in the game, with every Night Lord wanting to get their hands on them. Face Stompers were also added to the game during this era. These are an ITCG exclusive pair of shoes that came clean with 2 weapon attack. Until now, the best-in-slot shoes for a Night Lord were either the highest level option the player could equip, or really well-scrolled black snowshoes. Black snowshoes were usually the best option, since they didn't require any stats to equip and could give dex after being scrolled with shoe jump scrolls. There exist scrolls called shoes for dex, but these don't give dex. They give the stats that dex increases, making them useless for Night Lords. The accuracy given by these scrolls would be useful for other classes, but we'll cover that some other time. Just like the Pink Adventurer cape, these would have a huge impact on the Night Lord meta even before the introduction of Chaos Scrolls. Horntail was released in version 52 during this era. With it, Night Lords were given access to their level 30 Triple Throw Mastery book, increasing their damage output further. Horntail could also drop the Dragon Purple Sleeve Claw, the luck variant of the dragon weapons that Night Lords received. It was the new best-in-slot claw for a low-dex Night Lord, having 50 base attack compared to the Red Craven's 46. With this claw, low-dex builds finally became superior to dexless builds in terms of damage output as early as it could be equipped. Version 54 is our next stop. Showa Town was released with this update, giving us access to the Showa Exchange quest, where a player could turn in 100 Dark Cloud Foxtails for a chance at a pair of brown work gloves. As we know, attack work gloves were extremely valuable on a class whose damage formulas relied on pure weapon attack so heavily, and the 7-slot brown work gloves were highly sought after by Night Lords. They competed with Stormcaster gloves, only being better by 1 weapon attack when perfectly scrolled. Either of these gloves would have been very expensive regardless. Version 54 also brought one of the most damning pieces of gear for a low-dex Night Lord, the Maple Skanda. The release of this item made the already competitive dexless build even better, giving it the legs to compete with the endgame Dragon Purple Sleeve. It still didn't win, but it came much closer. It simply added fuel to the fire that was the discussion of dexless versus low dex. Believe it or not though, this wasn't the final dexless claw added to the game. Adding even more fuel to the fire of dexless versus low dex was the addition of Chaos Scrolls in version 56. These scrolls had a 60% success rate, and upon succeeding would randomly increase or decrease a stat by anywhere from 1 to 5. Any stat. As long as the item had that stat, it was eligible for this roll, even if that stat didn't occur naturally on the item. This created some interesting interactions. Remember the Pink Adventurer cape, the Face Stompers, and the Stormcaster gloves? These all had weapon attack on them clean, so you could use all of their slots to acquire massive amounts of weapon attack. Weapon attack scrolls didn't exist for capes or shoes at this time, and while they existed for gloves, the glove attack scrolls only had a maximum increase of +3 attack per slot. While it's extremely rare, it was possible to get 27 attack Face Stompers and Pink Adventurer capes and 30 attack Stormcaster gloves if we assume average base values. If it's not obvious, these items were best in slot. These attack values were equal to about 150 luck each. To put that into perspective, throughout a character's entire journey from 1 to 200, they'd receive a grand total of 1,030 AP. One of these items would equal 14.5% of a character's entire AP pool when converted to pure stat. This is just an approximation though. Another way to imagine it is by simply comparing it to a perfect red Craven, which has 86 weapon attack. Getting a perfect red Craven was ridiculously expensive, but let's assume this is the weapon we're using. We're going to assume we have perfectly chaos scrolled items, so it's only fair. These three items, when added together, just about match the weapon attack of this godly claw. Obviously, this is the absolute best case scenario and was far out of reach for anyone who wasn't a rich doctor or a hacker. But weapon attack is so strong that even if you could get a few extra points of weapon attack on these items, you'd still see a massive damage increase from them. Chaos Scrolls became a very powerful endgame option, and this was a shift in the meta that affected every class in the game. Even items like the Zachem helmet could be pushed beyond their original limits, since helmet dex scrolls only increased dex by 3 at most. Hello 67 dex and 67 luck Zachem helmets. The introduction of Chaos Scrolls was very interesting because it created a system that left players always wanting more, knowing they could get just a slightly better item even if it was ridiculously far out of reach. I can't stress enough how impossible it was to get items this good though. Chaos Scrolls were weighted in such a way that getting a +5 roll was very unlikely to begin with, much less getting it 10 times in a row for 2 separate stats. It was more common to see the Face Stompers and Pink Adventurer capes scrolled with dex scrolls to help the low dex Night Lord reach the Red Craven dex requirement. One of the last major pieces of content that we see in this era is the release of Crimsonwood Keep and Phantom Forest. With the release of Crimsonwood Keep, Bigfoot was added to the game. Bigfoot is a boss with a ton of HP who gave a ton of EXP. At least, he was supposed to be. In his initial implementation, Bigfoot was not properly labeled as a boss monster. If you recall, Shadow Web is a third job hermit skill that binds and deals damage to non-boss monsters based on their total HP. It functioned as a % HP damage over time skill, similar to Fire Poison's various poison dots. Because of this mislabeling, Bigfoot was released as a normal monster that was very easy to kill as a Night Lord by using Shadow Web. Even a hermit, as long as they had Shadow Web, could take down Bigfoot, giving 2.66 million EXP per kill. Bigfoot's HP to EXP ratio was already insane, 0.08 EXP per point of HP, whereas something like Skelegon's only had 0.06 EXP per HP. These numbers aren't incredibly useful on their own, they're mostly for a point of comparison where the higher value is better, but it's a strong indicator of just how good Bigfoot's EXP was if it was beating some of the best monsters in the game at this point. This Bigfoot mistake was quickly patched. Bigfoot was swiftly hotfixed to give very little EXP until Nexon could officially fix the improper designation. A lot of players were actually banned for abusing this Bigfoot glitch. Bigfoot wasn't the only boss available in Crimsonwood Keep though. The Headless Horseman was added earlier with the Haunted House, but was only available on one map until now, and that map didn't have a great layout with all of the junior wraiths jumping around. Headless Horseman is another very popular boss who spawns all over the place in Crimsonwood Keep and was a great training option for low-level ranged attackers. You'd primarily see archers, Night Lords, and eventually Corsairs killing these bosses. On the bright side, the release of Crimsonwood Keep included the best stars in the game, and these are still considered the highest tier stars nowadays. The Balanced Furies, which give +30 attack and require level 70, technically beat everything else, but only by a single weapon attack. The Balanced Furies are iconic, but there was a problem with these stars. Balanced Furies had a weird restriction for a while that disallowed them from being recharged anywhere except for NLC. This doesn't sound terrible. There are a few workarounds that might come to mind that mitigate this issue, but any kind of solution is a massive pain. Back in the day, Night Lords wanted at least 12 sets of stars, maybe even more. Carrying around all of these stars not only meant that you would have to spend a lot of money to get them, but they also took up 12 plus slots. With travel to NLC being very time-consuming, requiring the player to get on a train to NLC and then on a train back to Kerning City at the bare minimum, going out of your way to recharge stars wasn't a great option. Balanced Furies were completely tradable with no restrictions, so if traveling to and from NLC every time you wanted to recharge didn't sound appealing, you could make a mule to recharge for you, but that introduces more problems. First of all, you needed to expand your storage to accommodate the number of stars you'd be transferring back and forth. This likely wasn't a huge deal. Your main account would probably already have a lot of expanded storage slots, but if you made a level 10 mule to recharge your stars, you'd run into another issue, which is not having the claw mastery required for the extra 200 stars per set, meaning you'd effectively be running only 80% of your maximum stars. You could level this character, job advance to an assassin, and get to level 40 to unlock full claw mastery, but that's a lot of time investment for what ultimately amounts to a single weapon attack. There were probably players who went this route of the level 40 assassin mule to recharge their balanced furies, but it was not commonly done. A lot of people during this time simply recommended sticking with the crystal ilbies that a lot of high-level Night Lords had been accumulating for the past 8 updates. This was eventually changed and balanced furies became rechargeable everywhere, but I'm not sure when this change happened. Until it was fixed though, crystal ilbies remained the more popular and surprisingly more expensive option. The Phantom Forest also introduced the Crimsonwood Keep exchange quest. One of the rewards from this exchange quest was the Night Raven's Claw. It requires level 90 and gives 40 weapon attack, which is quite a bit lower than the Purple Dragon Sleeve. But as we've seen before, this difference in attack power doesn't actually matter that much when the lower attack weapon doesn't require any dex. CWKPQ was also added around the release of Crimsonwood Keep. CWKPQ's major reward was the Mark of Narracane, a pendant slot item that gave +10 attack and +5 all stats on average, being even better than the Horntail necklace that was maybe harder to get. Either way, the Mark of Narracane giving flat weapon attack made it far superior to the Horntail necklace. The extra 5 dex was nice, but both the Silver Deputy Star and the Horntail necklace also gave flat stat, so the Mark of Narracane didn't beat these in that regard. However, the +300 HP on the Mark of Narracane was very welcome for the squishy Night Lords. At this point in the game, a dexless build was technically the better option forever, solely because of the existence of the Night Raven's Claw. Without this claw, low dex would eventually win and continue to beat dexless builds, but because of the level cap being 200, it was not possible to acquire enough luck to beat the Night Raven's Claw with the available in-game option of the Dragon Purple Sleeve. With luck being factored in so heavily into a Night Lord's damage calculations, it was just impossible to make up the difference with the lost AP that would need to be added to dex. A lot of people think that low dex is eventually the superior option, but unfortunately it just wasn't mathematically with the existence of the Night Raven's Claw. Though it is worth noting that we're kind of splitting hairs with this comparison. Either build would work just fine, and the dexless build would definitely be the more expensive of the two options, but you'd be paying a lot for Night Lord gear regardless. So the 4th job era really changed things a lot. New Leaf City was a big part of these changes, but Crimsonwood Keep's content did a lot to boost the dexless Night Lord build to the level of being fully meta. At this point, you could go either build, and while dexless was stronger technically, it would require better gear to reach that point, and the difference wasn't that big. Triple Throw was a very strong skill, and since it used the same damage formula as Lucky 7, it really served as just a direct upgrade. There's no problem with it being a direct upgrade, but as someone who's played a lot of old school Night Lord, it really feels like 4th job was just Triple Throw and Shadow Stars. You can throw Taunt in there as well, even though it was just a passive. Every other skill was forgettable at best. I think people, myself included, wanted a new mobbing skill, but Night Lord never received anything better than Avenger pre-Big Bang. Moving forward, we enter the final pre-Big Bang era. Temple of Time was released in version 72 along with Pink Bean, who dropped the new Best in Slot Timeless gear. Even with the new Best in Slot Claw, it was still debatable whether the Timeless Lampion would be strong enough to bring low dex Night Lords back ahead of dexless Night Lords. It helped their case a lot, if nothing else. There wasn't a whole lot that happened during this Temple of Time era, actually. Night Lords struggled to get the HP required to survive a Pink Bean run, but this limitation would eventually be overcome. Mulong Dojo saw a release in version 75, bringing with it belt slot items that could increase dex even more, making the life of a low dex Night Lord a bit easier. With Mulong Dojo being purely bossing, it was an activity that suited Night Lords very well. We would soon see the release of Targa and Scarlion, bringing new bosses that Night Lords did well at, as well as an upgrade to the Zachem helmet in the form of the Scarlion hat dex. It has the same stats as a Zachem helmet, but with 2 extra base dex, it was technically the best in slot option. These 2 helmets were basically interchangeable though. Of course, almost immediately after this release, Ravana was released with the Golden Temple, bringing an even better hat that had plus 18 all stats instead. Potentials up to unique were added to the game in version 88, and it's hard to ignore how impactful that was for the game as a whole. This was the same update where Dual Blade was released, and equip enhancement scrolls were added as well, and the discussion of dexless versus low dex continued. With the addition of % luck on potentials, there was even more incentive to have as much luck as you could possibly get, further pushing dexless Night Lords to the top. But it only took one more update to place them so far above low dex Night Lords, and it made adding dex so bad that it was no longer even a consideration to be made. VIP claws were added with the Visitors update immediately after the Potential update, again being a ridiculously overpowered GMS exclusive dexless claw. The discussion of dexless versus low dex raged on before this point, with every new best-in-slot claw fueling the discussion even further, but after the VIP claw was added, this discussion was ended entirely. 64 base attack nearly matched a perfectly leveled Timeless Lampion, and the extra 8 luck on the VIP claw made up most of that difference. This was the best claw, and there was zero discussion to be had about it. Dexless would win from this point onward. The only issue is that the VIP claw was only available during this event. People got their hands on them, but for a long time they'd be super expensive, and the low dex build remained dominant only because of the lack of availability of these overpowered claws. And this is effectively the end of Old School MapleStory. Throughout this era, Night Lord was a dominant DPS class that never had any trouble with bossing outside of their squishy HP. Between the addition of the Wheel of Destiny, an item that revives a player on the same map, costing 50 cents per revive, and the various skills that could be used to work around this limitation that Night Lords had, they were always highly sought after bossing party members, bringing the most consistently high DPS in the game. And they were very cool. Thanks for watching. Before we end this video, I want to give a quick shout out to my channel members as thanks for their continued support. Remix My Life, Maple Ream, Tiago Nascimento, and Gummy Bullet for joining at the Togain tier. Velarex, Cass T, Aya Ayung MS, Sonia, Lake Tiger, and Ayub Idrissi for joining at the Togain Junior tier. If you want to support me, one of the best ways to do so is by joining the channel as a member. You'll get a special role in my Discord server, access to my video schedule and future plans, and my eternal thanks for allowing me to do what I love.